Hey, what's going on, everybody, and welcome back to my channel, Movie Files. Elliot back again with a brand new TV series review, and today we'll be discussing the new Amazon Prime horror anthology series by the name of Them, which I got the opportunity to check out early, and by the time this review is out, all 10 episodes will be available to stream on Amazon Prime on Friday, April 9th. Now listen, I have been waiting to talk about this show with you all, and I am so excited to let you all know what I thought about it, and if you all should check it out in this review. Before we dive into it, make sure you're following me on all my other social media accounts, which you can find those links in the description below. If you are new to the channel, welcome to the community. Consider subscribing to the channel, and while you all are at it, make sure you hit that notification bell. That way you all can get the alert from when I drop new content. It will mean a lot to me if you all can like and share this review. It helps out the channel a lot, but I also appreciate all the support. And in the comments below, let's discuss this series, guys. Let me know your pros, your cons, your favorite episodes, your least favorite episodes, your favorite moments, your favorite characters, and some of the stuff that didn't work for you all. Let's discuss it all in the comments below. So before we dive into this review, I want to let you all know how we're going to handle this review. So in the description below, there will be chapters, there will be time codes, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to break it down for everybody. So for those that are on the fence, should I watch the show? Is it any good? The first half of this video, no spoilers, just my pros, my cons, if you should watch it or not. That's the first half of this video. The second half, once you sat down, once you press play and watch all 10 episodes, I'm going to break down those episodes. I'm going to break down what worked for me, what didn't work, talk about the ending, talk about what I would like to see them explore next. We're going to break it all down in the spoiler half of this video. So again, no spoilers first half, second half, all spoilers, time codes, chapters in the description below. So with that being said, let's break down what this show's about, who's behind it, and what you can expect from the series. Them was created by Little Marvin and consists of 10 episodes, which range between 32 and 55 minutes. The show focuses on the Great Migration, which took place between 1916 and 1970, where roughly 6 million African Americans were relocated from the southern parts of the U.S. to the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. Many black families were drawn to California by the promise of industrial jobs and a chance to leave the Jim Crow South behind. On September 14, 1953, Henry and Olivia Emroy moved their family from North Carolina to Compton, California. The show follows a journey over 10 days where the family moves to their new home at 3011 Palmer Drive. So kicking things off in this spoiler-free portion of the video with my positives. Look, when it comes to me watching anything, and particularly in the horror genre, I want to root for the characters. I want to care for the families. I want them to succeed. And you get that with this show, ladies and gentlemen. I think the Emroy family were the best elements of the show. The family consists of Lydia, a.k.a. Lucky. You have Henry. You have Ruby. You have the little girl, Gracie. And, of course, you can't forget the family dog, Sergeant. From the very first frame, you care for the family. At least I did, because there's a family tragedy that they go through, and you see why they go from the South and make their way out to the West. They want the American dream. They want home ownership in the 1950s. And they think they might have left some of the racism in the Jim Crow South, but no, things are just immediately when they go to the West Coast, from their neighbors immediately wanting to get out of town to harassing them. We see Henry, a black educated man, getting the opportunity to work as an engineer, get racism thrown in his face on a constant basis. On his first day of work, the two little girls, you have Ruby and Gracie, their first time going to their schools, being called this, that, and the other. It was just like you care for the family. And then you have the mom, Lydia, who just came off of this family tragedy. She's dealing with that, her past trauma. And then she has Betty, the white neighbor across the street, who brings all the people together to try to get this black family out of the neighborhood. And not only is the family dealing with the racism that's going on in the 50s, the terror of racism, but then they're dealing with the horror in their basement. We have this dark, demonic entity that even the demon has his racist motive. So this show really makes you care for this family. You're rooting for this family to succeed. And again, I mentioned, to me personally, they were the show. They made this experience worth the watch just based on their struggle, their journey throughout the 10 episodes. In particularly, standout characters for me, starting with Lydia, played by Deborah, Ayorinde. She goes through it in this show, ladies and gentlemen. Again, from the very first moments of this show, of seeing some family trauma they go through, to seeing her protect her family, doing anything she can to make sure her girls are safe, her husband's safe, that her family is going to make it through. She's dealing with all that. But then she's being called crazy because she thinks that there's something in the basement. She thinks there's a demonic presence in the house. So seeing her even try to push through that horror trope, but she's not a crazy black woman. There is something in the basement. And again, protecting her family, the struggle that she goes through, the journey that she goes through. This is my first time seeing Deborah Ayorinde, and I thought she was fantastic. One of my favorite characters in the entire show, which brings me to her husband, Henry, who has his struggles. He's a black man who served in the military, no respect coming back home. He is a educated black man who gets the opportunity to work in California as an engineer, which wasn't even heard of during that time. He just wants to be equal. He wants to be seen as the same light as his white counterparts. But no, he doesn't get that. He gets harassed at work. He has the husbands of the neighborhood constantly calling him the N-word, a coon, you name it, messing with his daughters, messing with his wife. And he has his own thing that he's dealing with. This house has this way of getting to Henry in regards to a particular character by the toe tapping character that we'll talk about a little bit later. But in his struggle, learning more about his character, more so in the second half of this show, where you learn about his past in the army. You learn about what it was like for him being the father of having and dealing with the tragedy they go through in the first episode and protecting his daughters and protecting his family. Listen, the husband and wife dynamic, they clash at a point in this show, and seeing them trying to make it out of that was just a really great journey for those two characters. And I also want to highlight, I know a lot of people compared the show to the Jordan Peele 2019 or 2018. It's been so long. The movie Us, a lot of people, because of the posters, look like Us. But the only thing this show has in relation to Us is it has the same actress that was in that movie, and she is Ruby in this show. I'm speaking of Shahate Wright Joseph, a 14-year-old black girl in America who's dealing with her family stuff, who's dealing with moving to the West Coast. She's trying to go to this new school, and I honestly think I wish we would have got more from the Ruby character, because she got a lot of really interesting character moments. One of my favorite character moments later in the show, which we'll talk about in the spoiler portion, but I thought she was fantastic in this role, man. She did such a great job of making you feel for her. She's dealing with an identity crisis of sorts in this show in regards to what it's like to be a 14-year-old black girl in America dealing with all this racism. I thought that the young girl did an incredible job. One of my favorite characters for sure. So those are kind of my standout characters, favorite performances. Going into some other things I liked about the show, I have to applaud the production. The show had a great hair and makeup department, set designs, the way that they would use the camera when the Emroy family was in their house, and how the camera would like give you like this upward kind of weird kind of position in the camera to make the audience feel uncomfortable with the camera angles, because they want you to feel uncomfortable because the family's uncomfortable in this neighborhood as well as in the house. So I love the way that they use the camera. I love the visual effects, the practical effects, the use of the soundtrack, which has a lot of modern songs, but the modern songs that they chose were sampled from songs from the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and the way that they kind of infused the music into what was going on the screen I thought was really well done. Then just kind of tackling the storyline without diving into the spoilers, but the way the show handles the being black in America in the 1950s in the Jim Crow era, and how it tackled racism, and how the show never let their foot off the pedal when it comes to how this family was consistently bombarded with bigotry, with racism, with being called every single name you can think of, more than once, more than 10 times, N-word, coon, dirty N-word. I mean, they were giving it to them, and they never let up, and it really kind of hit home, and it didn't feel forced. It really kind of hit home the black struggle in America, trying to accomplish the American dream. You see that struggle within the show, and I thought they did a really good job of showing you the terror of racism. I thought the horror stuff was fine. We'll talk a little bit about later, but when it comes to them tackling racism and what it was like, the terror element and separating what's the difference between horror in the basement versus terror in reality was really well done. But I will say, when it comes to the horror, the show is very disturbing. There is a particular episode, which we'll talk about in my spoiler portion, episode 5. It was heartbreaking. It got me sick to my stomach. It was the shortest episode of the season, but it had the most emotional impact. So there are some moments in the show that I will warn you all, very triggering. It will make you upset. It will probably make you cry. So I will warn you, especially when it comes to episode 5. So I also want to applaud the show in tackling, things that a lot of people don't know about in regards to how in the 50s, how we perceive Compton in media and movies, it's a much different environment from what it was in the 50s. Back in the 50s, there were predominantly white people living in Compton versus, like I said, how it's portrayed now in movies and shows, primarily black people in bad neighborhoods and this, that, and the other. But back then, it was a much different time. And I like how the show tackles how they wanted to implement black people in the community for their own good. And I won't dive into the spoilers here, but it's very interesting to see how it was very segregated during that time and how they kind of set the segregation within the West Coast. And it's something that was very subtle, but something I definitely noticed was the parallel, how the show tackled the terrors and the trauma that are built in the foundation of the family versus the horrors that are literally in the foundation of the basement in the house. So little subtle things like that I really applaud the show in doing, which brings me into the format of the show, which again, all 10 episodes are available to watch today on Amazon Prime. But for me personally, I couldn't binge it, and it isn't any fault to the show. It actually succeeded in doing this, which is I didn't want to watch the next episode back to back to back. I only watched 2 episodes at a time because it was very emotionally draining in a good way possible, because I really care for what's going on. It's moments that you just can't, mentally speaking, I couldn't keep going through seeing our main characters dealing with this trauma, dealing with the racism, on and on and on. And there's actually a particular episode later on in the show, it's a flashback episode, where it's just like, this show is just like hitting you, and it was mentally draining. But again, I applaud the show for tackling the trauma of the Black experience. So again, I couldn't binge it, which brings me to a point. If you're watching this review, how did you experience this show? Did you watch all episodes in one sitting? Did you break it up to parts? Again, I had the opportunity to see this early, so it took me about 4 to 5 days to watch these 10 episodes, because again, I couldn't watch more than 2 episodes because it was so emotionally draining because of what our characters were going through. And I think that's in response to a show doing a good job of making it hit home for me. So transitioning into some of my criticisms that I have of the show, and I'm going to start off with the nitpicks. It's a horror show, so we know every genre, comedy, action, especially horror, has its tropes, and sometimes the tropes are just so played out with me in anything, but in particular in the show. I mentioned it earlier that Livia is being labeled as the crazy woman of the family. There's something that happens, she sees things, and no one believes her. How many times have you seen that in horror films? There's the trope of, okay, we have all of our life savings into this house. We can't just move because we'll go broke. Well, if your house, your life savings is in this house, but there's a demon in this house, what's the point of having a life saving if you can't even save your life? So it's just like little tropes that definitely kind of go, and there's more tropes the show has that kind of bother me, but I just wish they would have handled it more creatively speaking, to not just rely on the tropes that we've seen a million times. But that's just a little nitpick. Going into the meat and potatoes of what I did not like about this show, it was non-redeemable because it was the most uninteresting part of the show. The supporting characters. And I'm going to name them off here. I'm talking about Betty, Clark, the milkman, George, all of the Betty's friends and her wives and her husbands, including Marty, Earl, Sergeant Bull, Helen, Sue, and even Hazel. All the supporting characters to me were so underwhelming. They were underdeveloped, and they just felt like plot devices and not actual characters. And when it comes to, I talked a little bit about Betty Whittle. She is the wife, the head wife of the neighborhood, who wants to get the Emroy family out of this neighborhood because they were the first in neighborhoods, and this is their own little plot. But whenever we cut from the Emroy and focus more on those supporting characters, in particularly Betty, the show lost the momentum for me in regards to seeing her personal issues with her family, the wallpaper tearing off, paralleling to her tearing apart, her relationship with Clark, which they don't dive into, and the milkman George. All that stuff to me was easily the weakest part of this show. I mentioned how the show does a good job of handling the racism and the terrors of racism, but when it comes to the horror elements in the show, I don't think it mixed in that well, in my personal opinion. Whenever we would try to dive into the horrific elements, it almost felt like it was forced. It almost felt like it was shoot into the show, because we literally don't get a really good understanding and a grip of what's going on in the house into literally like 2 episodes into the show. So again, tackling racism, the terrors of racism, the reality of racism, and the fears that come with that. Supernatural was a little bit lackluster. It has an episode that they dive into it, but it felt like a little bit too little too late. And again, whenever we dove into it, it felt like it wasn't as organic as other elements of the show, which brings me into Henry and his plot. Without diving into spoilers, we see Henry. I feel like some of that stuff that he was dealing with in the second half of the show was kind of mishandled in regards to, no spoilers, but his boss Stu, the tap dancing character, Sergeant Bull, all the stuff that Henry goes through in the second half felt rushed to me, which brings me to my last point. The show starts off strong. The second half, episode 5 is the shortest episode, but most impactful episode. But episodes 6 and 7, it kind of teeters off. It kind of gets mediocre. And when we get to episodes 9 and 8, I feel like it was really, really rushed. Or I should say 9 and 10, it felt kind of rushed for me. And I think that the show could have been shortened down to maybe eight episodes versus 10, because there are some filler moments and some subplots that could have been completely taken out of the show. So overall, do I recommend you all give this a watch? Yes. I do have my issues with the show, and, I will warn you all again. This show is very triggering. It is extremely disturbing. There are some things that will make you sick to your stomach, so I will warn you there. But in regards to things that really stood out to me, I rooted for this family. The message of fighting for what you believe in, protecting your family, having the American dream of home ownership in the 50s through the lens of terror and horror really worked and shined for me, and were the shining points of the show. And again, the Emroy family, I care for them, so I would recommend you all give it a watch. And when you do, let me know what you thought of it. So that is the spoiler-free portion of this review. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. So we're about 13 minutes in. I'm going to try to, make this about 10 minutes maybe to dive into the spoilers, but we're going to break down the episodes, some more so than others. We're going to break down the ending and all into it. So again, you've been warned. Let's get into the spoilers. So episode 1. I mentioned that I think that the episode started off really strong. It didn't really necessarily hook me, but it had my interest. I was intrigued by the premise. As we see the Emroy family, the very first episode, the very first frames, we see Olivia dealing with the racist people that come and take her kid, Chester, who we'll talk about a little bit later, but seeing them and seeing her wake up from her dream, moving to California, this new life, this new American dream, and they are immediately looked at, picked on, made fun of. They're playing the music loud, trying to get them out of the neighborhood, and that's all being led by Betty Whittle, played by Allison Field, who I'm a big fan of. Allison. I watch American Horror Story. She's great in that show. She's great in other things like Devs last year. She's a great actress. Betty wasn't working for me in the show, guys, and we'll talk about it when we get some more episodes. But again, seeing that first episode, again, them tackling the terrors of racism was really well done. And as the show kind of wraps up, we get the supernatural elements. We get I believe the character name was Vera, who the little girl Gracie kept seeing. She chokes her, leaves a mark on her neck, and we obviously get the trope that the wife sees the mark on her neck, but no one else does, which they label her crazy. Which again, that trope was like, come on, we've seen the wife be called crazy, the husband seeing things, the daughter seeing things. Why aren't they coming together to get themselves out of the house? Again, some of those tropes didn't work for me, but I thought that first episode had a really good balance of terror of racism and the horrors that were going on in this basement, which we'll talk about how those horrors came to be in the basement. But I thought episode 2 was a really good, strong follow-up, because we get the dog, Sergeant. He gets his head snapped. I'm like, oh, I'm a dog owner, so that really kind of hit me, and seeing them bury the dog, which goes back to how they met the dog, which was a good way of, again, emotionally tying you into the first episode. And we get more of Henry's backstory, and we see him coming from the army, what he dealt with, smelling the pie, which to me was a good tie-in from the first beginnings of him and the pie, and how they ended the episode of seeing Olivia and Henry kind of butting heads a little bit, which was handled a little bit awkwardly to me, but nonetheless, it's all the stuff in the middle of the second episode that really kind of stands out to me. We get to meet the Sergeant Bull, who we see that he's the nice guy, but we end up figuring out his true motives with Helen and his connections to that character. We see Ruby and Henry, first day at work. Henry's getting racism thrown at him. He goes in the bathroom, he's screaming. We see Ruby being called monkey, and that scene there, again, I wish Ruby had a little bit more to do, because all her stuff was so interesting. Her having to deal with being black and wanting to be white, and an identity crisis that she deals with in the show. I wish we would have gotten more of that, but in that scene, I felt so bad for her. The teacher gives her a detention letter. She meets that girl who ends up being made up, but all that stuff in the middle of the episode was really intriguing. Cut the episode with them having the moment with the pie, and again, Olivia and Henry having to butt heads. I was wishing, like, I don't need you guys to be fighting. I need you guys to be on the same team so we can get out of this house and get this demon out of the house, more importantly. But transitioning into episode 3, which again, there were certain episodes, certain moments that I thought could have been maybe brought into another episode, or cutting some of the plot out entirely, as episode 3 kind of focuses on Betty and her relationship with Clark, who Clark's story went absolutely nowhere, but Betty and her relationship with the milkman George, which we'll talk about his moments. But we see Betty and Clark. We learn that they were the first ones in this family. They can't have kids of their own. So we see the animosity that Betty has for her friends, and the new black neighbors have kids, but I can't have kids. They kind of set that narrative into fruition. But we also learn more about the past of this house. We hear that there was a black family that used to live there, and we also get the name of their child, which was Chester, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We see Olivia having her first encounter with the farmer, who we learn out whose name is Epps in episode 8. She has an encounter with him, and then of course, like I said, by the end of this episode, we get the whole thing of Olivia is being considered crazy, and we end with the neighborhood putting in the grass, N-word heaven, and laying all the dolls in front of the house, which really kind of angered me that they have went to those extents to really get them out of the neighborhood. Which brings us to episode 4, which to me was an interesting episode because we see them, Olivia and Henry, getting back on the same page, which I was happy about. Again, I feel like that was kind of forced drama and forced kind of drama to have within the previous episodes with them and the pie and him smelling the pie. It reminded him of being in the army. But we get to them discussing their options. We can leave this house. I can kill all these white people, or we can fight for one another. We can fight for our family. We can make it through this. So we see them getting back on the same page. We see Betty and Olivia having their first encounter, which I was wanting to have more of that in the show. Again, they decided to give Betty the storyline of the George locking her in the bunker, which again, we'll get to that moment. But we see them kind of encountering each other. We see the seeds happening of Helen and her evil doings of how she's bringing the black people into these communities, knowing that they are just trying to increase the rates of these neighborhoods and all the stuff she has going on with the cops. And then we see, again, the unnecessary plotting happening with the milkman and Betty and them working together. Again, all that stuff to me just was completely unnecessary. We see Olivia meets one of the Johnson family, which was a very creepy scene when the husband's legs were cut off. The kids were in the stove. That was very disturbing. But again, it kind of sets the seeds with her learning more about the man in the black hat and that he has interfered with other black people in this neighborhood. Ruby has her encounter with the white girl at school, which we learn at this point that she's all made up at this point. And again, in regards to just kind of the background that's going on, we have Olivia and we have Henry, who again, they're getting back on the same page. They end the episode with them, having a sexual encounter, and then the man in the black hat is staring at them the whole time. So again, that particular episode 4, was fine, but again, the plots with Betty and the milkman George was just like, oh, I don't need this. But nonetheless, episode 5. It was 35 minutes long. This was the shortest episode of the season, and it had the most emotional impact for me personally. Listen, this episode was heartbreaking. It was very hard to get through. As we break it down, we see them again, the Helen, the cops, them setting up the plot of land and how they're going to bring black people into neighborhoods to make the value of the properties go up. Was a crazy scene to see how they again segregate the different neighborhoods. Was just crazy to see, and it still happens in the real world, which is crazy. But we see Helen and her doings and her introducing us to the Johnson family. We don't get more of Helen in the rest of the season. We see she gets attacked by this man, and that was the last time we saw Helen. But nonetheless, once we get past that scene, once Helen gets threatened, we see what happens to Chester, the Emroy's family. We replay the first episode. It cuts to them getting into the house. We see what they do to Olivia. We see them get the baby out of the closet. At this point, I'm like, okay, they're just going to take the baby and, do whatever they want with the baby and leave it up to the imagination of the audience. This show didn't let up. They were relentless. They tore my heart out in this moment. We see them put Chester in the pillow. Cat in the Hat, I believe, was the game they played. And, obviously you guys have seen the show, seen the episode, but that was just heartbreaking, man. That was like literally a moment I couldn't really watch the entire thing because it was just so hard. Obviously, it's fictional, but just imagining being in that moment with Olivia, with that child in that pillowcase, and then ultimately we see, the blood and the baby dies. That was an emotional episode, and seeing Olivia go through her emotional journey and feeling lost in the family, not knowing if they're going to get their mother back, that to me, again, it was the shortest episode, but it had the most emotional impact. It had the most disturbing scene of the entire show. And again, I thought that, seeing Deborah Ayorinde just really giving her all in that episode. And again, that episode to me was shocking. Let me know what you all thought about episode 5 and how you took it in. But cutting to episode 6, which we see Olivia starting to have the man in the black hat Epps kind of get into her head because she's imagining her killing her own kids. Everyone in the house starting to see things. Ruby again is continuing to see things. Henry seeing, what he went through in the war, but then he comes across the toe tapping dancer, which I assume that character was Jim Crow, which was a white man put on blackface. He gets to introduce him a little bit more into the show, and he's having these conversations about the Pentagon being taken away from him, the files, and him not being able to have stock into the company, and seeing him continuously being things taken away from him as we've seen so far in this show. We cut to Lydia meeting Mrs. Belmont, who's another black family that she ended up taking away her kids and her husband by putting bleach on them, which is a really disturbing scene. We see a really interesting moment here with Gracie having a cat in the hat moment and her mom having to get her from school and seeing all that stuff play out. And I thought this was a little bit cheesy, if I'm being honest with you. We see Henry pays a visit to his boss, which we'll talk about in the next episode. But we see for the first time in like 3 episodes, Lydia and Betty, they confront each other. She slaps her. They play the James Brown song. But it was like, I wanted more of that confrontation between those two characters. And we only get really 2 scenes of them interacting, which brings us into episode 4, which I thought was a very interesting episode. It has some great moments, not so great moments. As we break it down, Henry, he walks into his boss's house. They cut between what's going on with Betty, going to the milkman George. She wants George to kill the Emroy family. But going back to Henry, I am to assume that he killed Stu's wife. They don't show you it. They show you everything else. They show a baby dying, but they don't show you what he did to that woman. But I assume that he did kill his wife. We see him having the conversations with Jim Crow character in regards to, again, just he's losing his mind. The devils are attacking this family. They're manipulating everybody. We see Hazel manipulating Livia. We see Ruby being manipulated by the girl at school. We see again Henry being manipulated by Jim Crow, and all this stuff is really kind of getting onto them. It wraps up with Livia trying to kill Gracie, which she ultimately doesn't do. She's controlled by the man in the black hat. And this is where the episode kind of goes off the rails. Again, at this point, Henry, I assume, killed Stu's wife, but also he kills Sergeant Bull. And no one heard a gunshot. No one saw this black man in his white neighborhood kill this white police officer. Kind of unbelievable. Had to kind of, suspend my disbelief, but I was just like, oh, this is kind of, as I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, the handling of Henry and the Jim Crow character manipulating him just felt kind of rushed. As we wrap up the episode, Henry finds the bones of Chester, which obviously set him off, and we get the end of that particular chapter, because the very next episode, which I think was my favorite episode of the show. This episode kind of really got back into the first half of the show, which I think was the strongest half, the first 2 episodes. The flashback episode where we meet the preacher who talks to God, who's lost his family, who's kind of, questioning his faith. He meets Miles, who we find out Miles is the devil impersonating himself as a son. As we get this black couple whose wagon's broken down, they just want to get their wagon fixed, but they're kind of swindled into doing work in the town. We see them essentially being the parallels of the Emroy family, because this black family and this, I believe they were German, they are extremely racist, calling the wife all types of names, making fun of her, the husband. People are not believing him. They think he's doing black magic because he can pick the well where the water is, all that stuff. The episode was great. It was scary. It was eerie. It was the best episode to me. It reminded me a lot of The Witch. We see that the preacher loses his ways because, again, he's already kind of lost faith in God because he's lost his family. He questioned God's will. He makes the deal essentially with the devil by, fathering this Miles character. We see at this point he no longer cares for this family. He has the neighborhood. Oh my gosh. I mean, this episode was crazy. They blind them. They ultimately hang them. They have black magic at this point. At least they allude that they have black magic, which ties into the Emroy family at the end of the show. They hang them. They burn them alive. We see Epps and his son, Miles, go in the basement. Miles is revealed to be the devil. He makes a deal with the devil, and we see the whole town is destroyed, and that is the origins of East Compton, is this city that was burnt down by Epps and the devil. So really interesting flashback episode. Again, as I had mentioned, that part of the story, I mean, that's 8 episodes into the show. We could have got that way more earlier. They could have gave me less of the Betty, milkman, all that crap, and gave me more of that backstory. They could have intercut between that stuff, but I thought the episode was fantastic nonetheless, which brings us into the 9th episode, which felt so rushed. As I mentioned, I thought episodes 9 and 10 were just rushed. Livia's in the psych ward at this point. She can't see her family just because of I get it, obviously she dug up the bones of her son, which is very disturbing, but like, where does she go to the psych ward? That happened off screen, which I hate off screen development. Henry at this point, again, he's killed Stu's wife. He's killed the police officer, but nothing is happening to Henry besides him obviously being manipulated at this point. Give me all of this. Take this out of the script entirely. We get Betty and Milkman George. She's in the bunker. She's taken advantage of. Let's just talk about Betty. I did not like the character. When we meet her dad, we assume she's been, abused, sexually speaking. She wants the money. She doesn't get the money. Clark's storyline with him being gay and not diving into that. Again, all of the supporting characters to me were just plot devices. And when we focus on Betty and this bunker and her and Uncle George, or the Milkman George, why do we need it, ladies and gentlemen? As we even get more of unnecessary story from Marty and his wife, and spending time with them was so unnecessary. Betty stabbing George in the neck, and he's just like, I'm fine. I'm just going to walk up the bunker. I'm all good. I just got stabbed in the neck. Okay, what's going on there? Again, we see Marty at this point in the episode. He kidnaps or takes advantage of Henry and the girls, and they have them captive. He cuts off his finger, and all that stuff was very disturbing. But we wrap up the episode with Epps paying a visit to Livia. Again, episode 9 was very mediocre. I was not a fan of that episode, and I honestly wasn't a fan of the finale. Let's talk about the ending. Let's wrap up this portion of the video as we kind of break down the 10th episode. Betty realizing that the door has been open. She's running out of the bunkers, thinks she's going to go back home, and George kills her. He shoots her in the back. She's dead. Pointless storyline, unnecessary storyline. I could have went without it. Going back to the real stuff. As I kind of talked about Ruby and her having her struggles with being black and bleaching her skin in that one episode, which again, to me, I believe, which is episode 7, was a very heartbreaking moment. I wish we would have gotten more of Ruby, but Ruby, she helps her dad out. She stabs the guy in the back. We see at this point, Marty's running out of the house. Henry, with his Jim Crow manipulation, is about to kill, Marty in front of the whole neighborhood, but he hears her dad. She goes into the house. She's trapped in the house. Henry is dealing with him stuff. In the theater, we learned that Henry took his daughters to the theater on the day that Chester was killed, so that's what he's been living with. And then we also are cut in between with Livia breaking out of the mental ward. She's able to kill the main head woman of the, Nurse Ratchet, if you want to call her that. The black woman gets out of the chair, which to me kind of felt a little rushed, but she finally makes her way back home. We see at this point, Clark has broken the leg of Marty, which is just like Clark's storyline was so underwhelming. We see at this point, Livia saves her family. She saves her husband from the, Jim Crow character. She saves Vera, which was the character that Gracie was reading throughout the entire show, which that character just came out of left field, but she's able to defeat her. And I should say, actually, Gracie defeats her by tearing up the pages. That was a little bit underwhelming. She saves her daughter from cutting up her face, her self-identity crisis that she's going through, and she saves her. They save everyone. We get the end of the episode in which we see everything kind of wrap up. The devil at this point, Livia is going to confront the devil, aka Epps. She has her moment with him. She sees him from what he is. She sees him from being a phony and how he broke his religion. She ultimately takes away his cross. He loses his sight yet again, which means he breaks the deal with the devil, which kind of closes that chapter. As we see, the Emerald family is now, there's fire everywhere. There's black magic, if you want to call it that. They're staring at the white people. The white people are staring at them. The cops have their guns on them. End of the episode. So this is an anthology series, so I don't think we're going to get a continuation of that family. Again, if they do the American Horror Story route, we might get some of these same actors playing in different roles, but I don't think we'll get a conclusion to what actually happens to the Emerald family. I guess it just leaves it up to the imagination of the audience, which I am to imagine that things don't turn out well for the Emroy family because there are dead white people everywhere, and there are white people that will take the side of the dead white people versus what the black people were attacked by. So overall, again, you can see my thoughts on this series. There were some great moments, some great episodes. I wish we got more of Ruby's perspective of being a little girl, a 14-year-old girl in the Jim Crow 1950s, but she did a great job. Again, Livia and Henry had some ups and downs, some tropes they had to break through, but ultimately I thought they did a good job, and the Emroy family was the strongest element of this entire show. Betty, Clark, Stu and his wife, Marty, Milkman George, all that stuff was so unnecessary. Again, they gave me 10 episodes that could have been trimmed down to 8 at max, and they could have had a tighter story. But nonetheless, I enjoyed the experience. The tackling of racism and the terror of racism was really well done. Self-identity, being equal to your white counterparts, all this stuff was well done. But the horror stuff felt a little shoehorned, a little rushed, all those supporting characters. But nonetheless, it was a really good experience, and I'm excited to see what Amazon brings us with the season 2. What area will they tackle? What type of story? Would it be a modern story? Will it be back in the 60s? Things of that nature. I'm really excited to see what they do next. So there you have it. Every episode broken down, my pros, my cons, breaking down the ending. Let me know what you all thought of it, your favorite character, your favorite episode, your least favorite character, your least favorite moment. Let's break it all down in the comments. As always, make sure to like this video, share this video, comment below. As always, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell. That way you don't miss any of my other content. Hope you all are staying safe. We'll see you in the next video.